Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Malvika Gode, and I'm a senior associate in the GB and Ireland advisory team at Aurora. In this episode, we'll be looking at one of the fastest growing energy technologies in GB, batteries. While GB has been one of the most attractive battery markets in Europe for several years now, we've seen some new trends emerge in the last couple of years. For example, in this year's T-4 capacity market auction, a record 6 gigawatts of new build batteries secured contracts, half of which were over 3 hours in duration. In our advisory practice, we've also seen several batteries of over 100 megawatts enter the pipeline recently. Earlier this year, the UK saw its first large battery come online, that is Zenobē's 200 megawatt 2-hour storage asset, Black Hillock. This is also the first operational battery to provide system stability services, a role traditionally provided by synchronous thermal generators. Several other battery projects are now poised to do the same. So as the average size and duration of batteries in this market grows, and they're increasingly able to contribute to system stability, we'll discuss implications for both asset owners and the power system. And who better to discuss this topic with than today's guest, Tom Palmer, Head of Business Development for Network Infrastructure at Zenobē. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
Could we start with a bit of an introduction of yourself and of the work that Zenobē does?
Thank you. So my name's Tom Palmer. So I head up the business development team in our network infrastructure business, also known as like grid scale battery storage solutions. We're focused on kind of new business case, system services, bidding into those markets, and M&A across the business. Zenobē is an EV sort of fleet and grid scale storage specialist. So we're headquartered in the UK. We began operations back in the early day of the storage market in 2017, and now grown to over kind of 300 full-time employees across the business and more, and global base. In terms of like the grid scale storage side of the business, I guess we're one of the leading owner and operators of grid scale batteries on the transmission network, which is we focused on. We're expanding into Australia, in North America and Germany. And in the GB market, we currently have 1.3 gigawatts of battery storage projects either in operation or under construction at this point. So very important. On the other side of the business, we do this EV side, and we have about 25% of the market share of EV bus sector, operating globally in that area as well.
Well, with that done, let's talk batteries. So we've been seeing a clear trend towards larger battery capacities in recent years. Can you walk us through what you're observing in terms of battery size, and what do you think is driving this shift towards bigger installations?
Of course. So obviously we've always gone for, over the last sort of 5 years, focused on large scale. So the first of that for us was Capenhurst, which was kind of 100 megawatt scale. Just before that was Wishaw at 50. Black Hillock is initially 200, but expanding to 300. We've got Kilmarnock South at 300 megawatts, and we've got now Eccles under construction as well, which is 400 megawatts. So scale is just getting bigger. That's driven by investors getting comfortable with the market. So obviously the storage sector isn't really that old. It also in GB stemmed back to the enhanced frequency response market back in 2016, and NESO then opening up a market by providing these rapid services. So it's grown considerably then. I think we're over 6 gigawatts of projects now live on the system. And that's just going to get bigger, right? I think last week, Fidger announced the 1.4 gigawatt project. We're now in a giga scale size of storage projects, which is fascinating. And that's because of comfort in the technology, financing, route to market, floors and tolls supporting that, advancements in the technology as well from the battery storage providers. So it's a big change. It's not surprising. You need scale because it improves the economics. Obviously, you're able to have greater purchasing power, and increasingly now we should be able to be taken as large assets in by NESO when it comes to like balancing mechanism, and markets aren't restricted. So storage started in ancillary services or balancing services, the requirements were smaller. So, building a 50 megawatt asset made sense. You're now operating in the wholesale market where there is the liquidity to do large scale. Obviously, we still need improvements in the balancing mechanism to really take those assets, but it's a substantial change. And I think the trend recently has been gigascale in terms of megawatts now, getting to that sort of half a gigawatt scale, if not larger. The next trend is really duration, though. It's the longer duration is key. So we've already seen 3.3 hours on the system. That is going to get longer. 4 hours will easily be standard shortly because there is a cannibalization risk to projects of just building out 2 hours. So obviously long duration as well is being explored, and we're waiting on Ofgem. So it's just going to be a trend now, larger batteries, but also longer duration.
Okay, great. I'm glad you mentioned the balancing mechanism, actually, because that was going to be my next question. One of the operational challenges we hear about in the industry is high skip rates for batteries in the balancing mechanism. For our listeners who might not be familiar, the skip rate refers to how often economic bids are rejected in the BM. This means that a battery offering to turn up at a price cheaper than, say, a CCGT might be passed over in favor of the CCGT. So, Tom, I understand Zenobē's done quite a lot of work thinking about this particular issue. What's your understanding of the causes behind these high skip rates?
Yeah, so we've been lobbying and challenging, let's call it, rather than lobbying, over the last 2 years, especially when our first Wishaw battery went live. So that asset in Scotland, our strategy is about locating the storage historically in Scotland to basically, instead of turning off the wind, you import the energy into the battery, avoiding turning off renewables, and then being able to export that energy later after the constraint. And you're saving consumers money because it's cheaper than the bid-off price for effectively the wind. So we've been focused on this for a while. We've been challenging NESO, government and Ofgem over the historic performance. And we did see some initial improvement. It's an improvement for a not very high bar. So to give you some perspective, the average skip rate for constraint skips, as we call it, or so where it's a system action, i.e. you're behind a constraint boundary and you could import, that's rather than kind of an energy action. Now that's, when we started with Wishaw, that skip rate was at 93% in 2023. That has come down probably to around 80%, but that's still 80% of the asset being skipped that could effectively save consumers money, increase renewable generation. And to give you some kind of scale, that's even in this year, our assets have skipped the equivalent of 126 gigawatt hours of energy that could have been used. Now, not all of that could have been used in reality, because if the action had been taken earlier, it would have been restricted. But there's such a large amount of wasted ability on the system to save consumers money and reduce costs. And that's just going to become even bigger because we now have Black Hillock, as you mentioned, that's 200 megawatts. We're going to have Kilmarnock, hopefully at the end of this year. We have Eccles after that. These are all getting bigger, and it's not just us. Other competitors are also building in Scotland. The Clean Energy Plan demonstrated the need, I think, for about 7 gigawatts of batteries in Scotland. So we need to get this sorted, and progress has been slow, right? So it's great. We might congratulate ourselves, and NESO has made improvements, but we need to do more and quicker. Whether that's putting more people in the control room, whether that's spending more money. There is a trade-off at the moment. There's more cost to consumers, and we don't want more headlines on cost of constraints when we can manage some of those solutions now. So I think that is the biggest issue for us. I would say there has been probably more improvement on the energy action. So, for example, offers, and that has probably been the initial focus of NESO rather than these constraint skips. But the quicker win is constraint skips. You can easily turn off, instead of turning off the wind, you can import in the battery before you turn off the wind, and you save consumers money. So we'd like to see that go much faster, much quicker, and really see more movement. On the other side, There is the kind of grid code change, GCO 166, which will substantially improve the ability for NESO to take actions on longer duration storage because you get a better view of it. You get better insight in the control room. But again, I would say that's probably 18 months behind schedule. So we're not really filling ourselves with glory about change processes here and saving the consumer money quickly. So more needs to be done by NESO, DESNZ, Ofgem to really get this going.
So one of the points you mentioned just now was putting more people in the control room. And the reason you're saying that is because the current balancing mechanism process is quite manual. So one of the solutions that the system operator NESO has thought of to improve this process is the open balancing platform, which automates the BM a little bit. This was introduced in December 2023. So we've had, over a year of experience with it. How is your experience with the OBP been? And do you think it's improvements to the OBP that are needed, or is there, is that not the right solution? There's a different solution that needs to be found.
Yeah, the OBP is a substantial reform process of the control room that is almost 2 years old now, which is amazing to think that it's been running that long. With any kind of change process, of course, it's not straightforward. Have we seen the expected changes we would have hoped for? No. Like, we've seen improvement. Is it enough? No. Have we resolved the constraint skips or seen enough action there? No. Is there a longer term plan on the OBP? Yes, obviously there's going to be further reforms, further changes. But to me, IT is one of the solutions, right?
Yeah.
The other is having more resource in the short term while you go through it. And it does take a while to train up control room staff, but we often call up control room and tell them when we're being skipped. We'd rather see it the other way, where, there's someone, maybe there's extra people in the control room having those discussions, employing more people to review the actions taken in the control room and identify where those skips are taken and feed that back to people in the control room, right? It's not an easy job being in the control room. It's real-time decision making. I totally understand that. But if they're not being fed back areas where they could change or improve or make better decisions, and we put a bit more resource in that in the short term, it could be millions of savings easily.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've talked about this trend of battery sizes increasing. Now, the balancing mechanism is a smaller market, so to speak, than the wholesale market. Do you see a change in battery revenue dynamics or operational dynamics? Is there more larger batteries entering the market and maybe not as much available volumes in the BM for these batteries to take up? Do you see any changes expected there?
Yeah, I think in Scotland there is a clear opportunity and depth in the balancing mechanism to support projects. Like, obviously that is limited. It's not an endless, it's not even a market, it's a mechanism, but effectively it's not an endless amount of volume, but there is enough there. And obviously the Clean Plan 2030 and the upcoming Strategic Spatial Energy Plan obviously should account for that, as well as obviously what goes on with network build out. So there has been a big opportunity. Obviously, we're spending a lot on constraints. The forecast is growing.
Yeah.
That will later come down through this planning better of the network. And so, yes, I think there's still a deep market in the short term. That won't be sustainable forever. But as costs come down and there's additional services like stability and other markets for storage to actually add value, then I think that's not necessarily a problem.
Yeah.
So you'll still be able to arbitrage, you'll still be able to get more actions on the offer side as you displace CCGTs for offers, or, we spend a lot of money bringing on Pembroke Power Station to provide inertia and voltage. If you have storage in the right locations, you don't need to do that, and it will be cheaper. So yeah, I think that it will be a changing market. We've obviously changed from ancillary balancing services as a predominant source. We've moved to kind of wholesale BM. I think that will continue. It's just that kind of shape of the BM
Yeah.
and what's required in it will develop over time.
And one of the advantages that batteries have is that they've always been a very flexible and adaptable technology, not only in the physical sense, but also in the sense that they've seen a changing revenue stack over the last 5 or 10 years, and they've always managed to adapt and come out on top. So hopefully that remains the case for a good long while. You mentioned, batteries being able to contribute to new services like system stability. So that's a really interesting new development, because there's a lot of discussion in the industry now about batteries contributing to stability through grid forming inverters. I understand that your existing site, Black Hillock, also has grid forming capabilities. Could you tell us a bit about how this technology works and what role batteries can play in maintaining grid stability?
Yeah, so we're providing grid forming solutions on Black Hillock. We're also doing it on Kilmarnock and Eccles. They won contracts in the Stability Pathfinder Round 2 to provide inertia and short circuit level and reactive power. We're also providing it on our Shetland project, which is a very different project, but that would also provide grid forming ability to stabilise the grid in Shetland in the event of transmission link going down. So for us, it's a big part. That market is still maturing. NESO obviously launched Stability, that SP2 or Stability Pathfinder 2 round. That enabled us to effectively provide the cheapest form of stability on the network compared to any other technology. So we've kind of demonstrated the cost element and the ability to do it. Black Hillock is operating in providing the stability now. It's already supported the grid on numerous occasions, like when the 3 Drax units tripped earlier this year. We're providing that inertia. That means you can save on having to bring on other assets to provide inertia. Obviously, synchronous condensers are also providing that service, and they're competing. Pump storage will compete. So there is a growing market there of competition, but storage is able to deliver at the lowest cost. So it's really important that this grid forming technology is used and it's tested. So hopefully NESO now gets the comfort from Black Hillock and others under these Pathfinder projects, and we can provide that inertia, short circuit and reactive power automatically from these assets. And that's still the beauty of it for storage, is that we can still do other things, right? Unlike all those other technologies, synchronous condensers, pump storage, there is a greater opportunity cost because you have to change what you're doing in the market. We don't have to as batteries. We can still do the active power. We can still do all the other services, and we can still provide stability at the same time. So that's the beauty. That's why everyone obviously talks about storage as a Swiss Army knife or whatever you want to call it. It can do so many different things. I still don't believe there's another asset, and maybe someone will correct me if I'm wrong, that can do as many services in supporting the grid as a battery can at the moment. So I think it's, that's one of its USPs in the market.
Yeah.
It makes it challenging though when you're doing commercial agreements with parties to optimize. You've got so many revenue streams. You've got all these new schemes to bid into. And NESO is doing a long-term tender at the moment called like 2029 tender, or a kind of year -4 as it's known in the industry. And there'll be more opportunity there. There does need to be further work though done. So the design of that scheme doesn't necessarily lead to fair competition in the market, because bays have been reserved for synchronous condensers effectively because they're 0 megawatt bays. And a storage is about stacking, and you need active power at the same time. So there needs to be improvements in the procurement process that enables fair competition, firstly, and then you will get batteries demonstrate that they can deliver the lowest cost. And there's an upcoming year -1 tender for inertia that will be fascinating to see the outcome in that as well, where batteries will be participating. So yeah, lots to be done still, and we're also going to be moving to more of like a day ahead market for that. So yeah, we think it's an important part. It's not an endless requirement. You don't necessarily need it everywhere, because there's a limited amount of procurement. But it's an important part for batteries to, again, provide another service. And I would say that's important for NESO as well, right? Because of constraints on the system, they're trying to reduce that. And sometimes they don't actively need active power all the time. Sometimes they just want the other services. And if storage can provide that, that's great.
Yep. And hopefully with time and more experience on how these grid forming inverters perform, it can become a part of the bankable revenue stream and bolster the business case for batteries as well, especially if we see the BM getting more competitive. So I'd love to hear about your experience with Black Helix so far. What have been the key learnings from this project? And have you seen any special considerations or differences in operating this size of a battery versus, say, a standard 50 megawatt BESS?
Yeah, thank you. Black Helix, I think where we see the challenges is around, because grid forming is a new technology, it takes time to implement compliance processes around it. So it's a new technology for NESO and transmission owners. It takes a while for them to get comfort, and they're learning at the same time. So I think what we experience from Black Helix is a learning for us, but also for NESO, because it doesn't operate in the same way you're used to. You're always providing these services, but as I mentioned, you're still doing all of those other services. So it's fascinating from that perspective. So I think there were some challenges, but we and NESO will get the lessons learned from that, and that will just enable us to be better, quicker on future projects. But the actual service is delivering that stability, it's providing a savings to consumer already, and that's great. So we look forward to getting the others live and providing more and demonstrating and hopefully building more confidence, like with NESO, to procure more from storage, but also other markets, right? The other markets look at the GB market and see the fascinating things NESO is doing, the innovative schemes. So we expect to see that kind of deployed in other locations as well.
Great. Maybe shifting the discussion now towards the commercial side of things. We've seen significant transaction activity in the battery market lately, both publicly announced deals as well as through our work with advisory clients. From your perspective, what does investor appetite look like in the market today? And would you characterize this as a buyer's market or a seller's market?
Yeah, it's a really interesting market so in terms of transactions, there has been a number of transactions from different parties entering the market. We ourselves have acquired a Harker project, 400 megawatt, recently. There has been challenges as well, though. At the time when people are looking to acquire to build out portfolio, we're also going through connection reform. So having certainty for people looking to acquire projects isn't there. Now, under that kind of connection reform, there was protections put in place, but they really only covered projects up to 2027. Beyond that, everyone is waiting at the moment for a call from NESO to go, yes, you've got this date, you've got a project, and then they can start cracking on. Obviously, there's a lot of people in the industry who got connections to develop and then sell projects, right? Some are developers, some are flippers, call them different things. So they're waiting in bated breath to hear about that connection form, like everyone else is who's also developing greenfield projects. So that's been the kind of, I would say, challenge, because there's been a lot of people come to market with, we've got this massive portfolio of projects out to 2035, 2040, and they become a bit worthless, right? No project beyond 2030 at the moment is certain. Even how much we need beyond 2030 is actually the big question, because in the Clean Power 2030, the target for 2030 was the same as 2035. So we basically said, we're not sure if we need any more in 2035 over 2030. We're going to go and see what the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan comes out with. But at the same time, in the connection form, we basically said, we're going to protect any project we're planning. So we've got this fascinating time where there's going to be way more storage projects still built or still have protection than we need under the 2030 target. So is the key question will be then how much do you need by 2035? Do you actually need more, or have we already got enough? So that's going to be an interesting bit. So at the moment, I would say it's a kind of, is it a buyer's or seller's market? It's been probably a buyer's market because there's been a lot of people selling. That may change. It may then move to a seller's market as those projects come about. But I guess on the other side of transactions, I guess, is the kind of interesting thing we've seen where I think the National Wealth Fund, who has recently supported three parties now in the market, so effectively a arm of the government in one way or another, is potentially the largest equity investor in the storage market. So that's fascinating, seeing how government is getting involved through the National Wealth Fund, ensuring projects get developed in the storage sector and getting those projects that need to be delivered before 2030 out there. However, you can't rely on the National Wealth Fund filling the rest of the requirement, right? The risk in National Wealth Fund itself, now they will have a lot of risk associated with BESS, grid scale BESS. So how much they can really take on in terms of risk now from an equity perspective is going to be a challenge. The other thing is, like, from a debt side, the market is pretty healthy. I would say that's been, in all those projects recently announced, there has been enough debt providers willing to come in and support. That's partly driven by, I would say, a change to getting more protection in floors or tolls in the market. So the inherent market risk for batteries still exists. There's volatility, there's uncertainty in prices, there's changes in TNUoS, there's P462 around changing the cost in the balancing mechanism to import, the skip rates. There's a lot of concerns for investors, right? It's not straightforward. So many look to floors or tolls, and that provides greater certainty of the investment. It de-risks it for the banks. Those parties probably offering those floors or tolls can make a good profit as well in the market. So I think that's the really interesting bit that's sort of taking place at the moment. Obviously, we've also just gone through the REMA decision on zonal versus national price. I think that also caused uncertainty for people choosing to buy assets. And then I guess the other trend is we're seeing people kind of sell down part of projects or sell down the risk in projects as well. So that's will be a growing market, showing the confidence of investors as well. So yeah, still lots of change going on, and I think you'll see appetite and transactions probably increase again next year once connection reform comes out and decisions made.
That's definitely a very interesting explanation for why we see tolling agreements becoming so popular in the market, because that's a clear trend that we see now. Finally, with several gigawatts of battery capacity now competing for a limited amount of grid capacity and investment, differentiation becomes crucial. So how does Zenobē differentiate itself in the market?
Everyone will try and differentiate. Our focus obviously was about innovation, and innovation through, not for the sake of it, but where there is a need for it, and that is through grid forming technology, where it enables us to participate in those additional revenue streams. That enabled us to stack additional revenues on top. Some of those revenues are contracted over long periods of time, so that provides certainty to make the investment as well. So I think that's been maybe our differentiation in the market. I guess we've also focused on Scotland as our locations for asset to build, because we think there is an immediate solution to save consumers money by importing in the battery first. As we talked about, unfortunately, not all of that has been done on the other side with skips, and we're still pushing for that. There has been improvements, but I think we need more done there. So I think that's kind of been our focus. That may change. Obviously, constraints will change on the system. The interesting thing is what happens with strategic spatial energy plan and this connection reform piece, as I mentioned. So obviously the connection reform will tell people and give certainty to their grid connection out to 2030. We've obviously set locations for that requirement. And a large part of that is a large part in Scotland. Interestingly, some of those zones have barely anything. Like if you take East Anglia and you take the sort of the zone to the far east of that area, there's a very little requirement, interestingly. So you've then got strategic spatial energy plan that I think will then need to rethink that and actually have a look more at some of the zonal requirements. Like if we're building more offshore wind in East Anglia, we've got nuclear connecting, we haven't got grid upgrades, but the requirement may change. And so you'll definitely see a change in that zonal build out. There's so much uncertainty at the moment until we see that strategic spatial energy plan for a business to plan where to connect in the future, because obviously people will go and get planning, have sought to get connections. But, we've had announcements on data centers, where are they going to be located? That will be a huge driver of using grid connections on the system. Where that future offshore wind, how it will be coordinated. The zonal treatment of offshore and solar is very high level in clean energy plan. So there's so much uncertainty still at the moment. It's quite difficult. Now, that doesn't stop people, right? People still went out and got grid connections based on fundamentals of areas they thought there was value. But it might not. We're moving to more of a centralized planning approach across the energy system, and people will have committed and made decisions and then won't be needed later in that location. And obviously things like planning don't last forever. You only have limited time in your planning applications. So yeah, there's been a lot of people investing, spending the time, and it may not materialize into a project. But that's been a strategic decision by government to progress to more centralized planning, which makes sense, right? It's using the system better and more efficiently.
Tom, this has been a fascinating conversation, not just about batteries, but about ancillary services and the policy issues that have been on everyone's mind for the last few months. So maybe let's wrap up on an optimistic note. And I'll ask you, what is the trend or opportunity that you're personally most excited about in the battery market over the next few years?
Yeah, I can't wait to see the kind of day ahead markets open up for, I guess, inertia, especially because there's so much more people can provide in real time, and that's a fascinating development. So I'm really keen to see that progress. I don't think it's going to come in until 2027 at the moment, and I guess, but there's a lot of other changes I'm fascinated by whether they will be good or bad is a different thing. So we're going to have a change to locational balancing services, procuring them in different places. So we didn't necessarily go for a zonal market, but we need to procure better in some of those system services. And then, some people may find it the most boring topic, but the transmission license condition or transmission constraint license condition is going to have to change. The focus on government is managing constraint costs. So I think across all technologies, I think storage is the rules are somewhat vague and people are trying to follow them, but it's quite vague. So I think need to be big changes there, and across all technologies, improving that and getting better clarity will help bring down costs as well. So yeah, lots to look forward to, or maybe be scared of and change, but it makes it an interesting sector.
It certainly does. Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
That was Malvika Gode, a senior associate in the GB and Ireland advisory team at Aurora, talking to Tom Palmer, head of business development for network infrastructure at Zenobē. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.